Chapter 1: Blind Trust. The 7 Threats of Large Group Identity. The mind has no freedom. Its thoughts are nurtured by old ideas. Fazıl Husnu Daglarka. Our First Bondage. Translated from Turkish by Talat S. Halman. Soon after the 1991-1992 war between Serbs and Croats that followed the post-Soviet collapse of the Yugoslav Federation, Maja Bajić-Bjegović, a young Croatian psychiatrist from Zagreb, Croatia's capital, accompanied a team of German mental health workers assigned to the ruined border city of Vukovar. During the war, Serbian troops had forced the city's Croatian residents into central Croatia and had burned their houses, so Vukovar's population after the war was almost entirely Serbian, though the city itself remained within Croatia's boundaries. At the time that Bajić-Bjegović went to help assess Vukovar's post-war needs, even a civilian Croat strolling through its street was at risk. The Serbs exhibited hostility towards anyone or anything Croatian. Acutely aware of the danger, the German team asked Bajić-Bjegović to pretend to be German during their visit and, above all, not to speak Croatian. At one point, the group entered a restaurant where no one spoke German or English, and the team members found themselves unable to order. It was then that Bajić-Bjegović, spontaneously emphasizing her Zagreb accent, began to tell the waiter what they wanted to eat. As she addressed him, she later said she felt increasingly agitated and found herself speaking very loudly as if she wanted everyone in the restaurant to hear her. As she told me later, she felt almost obliged to show every Serb nearby her true large group identity. After a few tense minutes, the group was able to eat, and they returned to Zagreb without incident. In that moment, protecting her psychological existence as a member of her large group was more important to Bajić-Bjegović than the risk of bodily injury or even death. Large group affiliation can be so powerful because an individual's sense of ethnic, religious, or national identity is so closely tied to his or her core identity, his or her deep personal sense of sameness, of stable gender and body image, and of continuity between past, present, and future. Most of the time, we are not even aware of this link until our large group identity is threatened or until an event occurs in which group belonging gives us pleasure. The fortunes that bless and the misfortunes that befall our large group make us happy or sad, and they reinforce our sense of belonging. This is especially clear in groups that are otherwise relatively homogeneous. In countries such as North and South Korea, for example, even in nations with a non-homogeneous population such as the United States, the umbrella of large group identity covers everyone. Whatever their ethnic background, Americans go about their daily lives without thinking much about it. But even American identity is threatened. Most Americans tend to personalize that threat immediately and to experience it as an attack upon themselves, as we saw so dramatically after the September 2001 terrorist attack on New York and Washington, D.C., and with subsequent events in Afghanistan and Iraq. But here already we encounter the challenge of large group categorization in everyday speech as well as in formal scientific and policy discourses. We use terms such as race and nationality to classify large groups. On the other hand, much scholarly work has debunked the scientific reality of racial difference and has demonstrated the invention of modern national communities. For the very reason that these are conventional categories. However, they are also the categories by which the vast majority of people understand the structure of their own and others' large group identities. For our purposes, the experience of oneself as a member of an ethnic, racial, national, or religious group is in fact the relevant criterion for using such classification. My focus here is not on these classifications per se, but rather on the psychological processes common to all large group entities which bring these classifications to life. Therefore, only a brief sketch of the most important large group identity categories is necessary here. The word ethnicity is derived etymologically from the Greek word ethnos, meaning company, people, or tribe. Roger Scruton defines an ethnic group is one fixed by virtue of long-standing association across generations, complex relations of kinship, common culture, and usually religious uniformity and common territorial attachments. Anthropologist George De Devos cites a set of elements including folk, religious beliefs and practices, language, a sense of historical continuity, a belief in a common ancestry and place of origin, and a collective history shared by members of an ethnic group and absent in others with whom the group associates. As we can already see, categories of large group identity in practice do not swing free of one another. Ethnicity incorporates religious identity and perhaps national identity as well. But I begin with ethnicity because I believe it's the privileged category of large group identity. Anthropologist Howard Stein has observed that ethnicity is not a category of nature, but a mode of thought. We can go further and say that what lies at the foundation of one's sense of ethnicity is a mode of affect. Ethnicity reflects the feeling and thoughts that connect people with those who unconsciously and symbolically feel like their mothers or like other important caretakers of childhood. Thus, ethnicity not only refers to a human sense of belonging at a basic emotional level, but also defines we-ness by defining the other who is not like us. Religion, from the Latin religare, meaning not bind together again, to bind together again, is also connected with individuals' basic modes of feeling and thinking from their early childhood. It has historically provided not only a bond between human beings and a sense of the divine, but also a feeling of collectivity among followers. But religion is usually less specific than ethnicity in defining the uniqueness of a group of people and the specificity of their shared identity. Different groups may share the same religion while each of them hold on to their specific characteristics as ethnic groups, which may at times supersede the religious bond. For instance, though extremist religious fundamentalism initially bonded followers of the Taliban together, the followers' own ethnic affiliations resurfaced as the Taliban was being toppled by the pressure of US attacks during the fall of 2001. Afghans placed a renewed emphasis on the foreignness of some Taliban followers and of Osama bin Laden's Arab supporters. Sometimes groups who are from the same ethnic root, such as South Slavs, absorb different religions and emerge as distinct groups, in this case as Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, and Muslim Bosniaks. But I consider Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks to constitute different ethnic groups because over centuries of historical experience, their religious affiliations have come to define these groups as distinct cultural ancestral units. Though it's fair to say that in Europe, newer concepts of nationality have tried to fill a vacuum that was previously filled fully by religion after the 1789 revolution and the tragedies of the Napoleonic Wars. For instance, the French people continued to share religious beliefs with others outside their nation state, but the nation now provided a more restricted frame of reference for their shared identity. Religious belief, nevertheless, has remained powerful. Human ideologies have not fully replaced divine directions, then, but rather have combined with them in sometimes strange and unpredictable ways. Scruton observes, religion and politics can never be separated in the minds either of believers or of those who seek to govern them, and religious conceptions have influenced almost all of the concepts and institutions of modern Western government. The law through canon law and natural law, sovereignty through the doctrine of international jurisdiction, property through the doctrines of the just price and usury, social welfare and education through the command of charity, political obligation through the commands of piety and obedience, and political stability through the belief that perfection belongs not to this world but to another. Today, ethnic terrorism in the Middle East and Northern Ireland, as well as the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, are openly associated with religion in the United States. Militia associations and their sympathizers are influenced not only by the literature of the radical political right, but also by apocalyptic evangelical Protestantism. As political scientist Michael Barkun comments, the militia's superficially secular ideology, the belief that constitutional government is threatened by clandestine political and economic forces, masks close and direct religious associations. These associations link the conspiracy with Satan's struggle against God, the rise of the Antichrist, and the immense of the end times. Wait, one more time. The militia's superficially secular ideology, the belief that constitutional government is threatened by clandestine political and economic forces, masks close and direct religious associations. Okay, these associations link the conspiracy with Satan's struggle against God, the rise of the Antichrist, and the immense of the end times. Religion as a demarcation of large group identity continues to play a role, often a key one, in ethnic and national politics and in international relationships. Ethnicity then incorporates religion as well as language. Connected with shared images of the group's history, it establishes an especially sharp sense of us and them. Perhaps when nationalism swept through Europe after the French Revolution, it created modes of feeling and thought among national groups resembling the ones we find in ethnic groups. The nation-state, as it is now commonly understood, is indeed a relatively recent Western invention. And creating the Western nations did require struggles, often bloody ones. In other places, nations have been born by different means. Kuwait, for example, was founded by the Al-Sabah dynasty and two other families who migrated from the Arabian Peninsula. Over the centuries, they were joined by others of both Arab and Persian origin from surrounding areas. Slowly, a national identity developed that can best be described neither as inevitable nor as accidental, but rather as the product of both conscious and unconscious decisions, shared dedication, and a common history. In this, Kuwait is what historian Peter Leuenberg would call a synthetic nation. Synthetic nations such as the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia are invented when people otherwise diverse in ethnicity, race, and/or religion transcend their differences within a particular geographic space. Leuenberg cites Otto Boyer's notion of continuity of fate as the common element linking such disparate individuals into a cohesive large group, a community constituted and shaped by shared experiences. Since nations are born differently, the degrees of inclusion and exclusion, of grievance and entitlement differ from one particular nation to the next. After the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, for example, when the state of Macedonia was born, issues of inclusion and exclusion and of grievance and entitlement surfaced because 1/3 of the people in Macedonia are ethnic Albanians. During my spring 2000 fellowship at the Itzhak Rabin Center for Israel Studies, I had the opportunity to observe firsthand an especially difficult process of synthetic nation building in progress. Israel, though nominally a mono-religious state, in fact seeks to synthesize a population of immense ethnic and cultural diversity into a nation. To pre-Holocaust Zionist settlers, Holocaust survivors and their descendants, all mostly European in origin, more recent immigration has added 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union and more than 80,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel's population. Consider Israel's 1 million, mostly Muslim, Arabs and its small but significant Christian and Baha'i minority communities, as well as the substantial number of sects and variations within Judaism in Israel, and it is not difficult to see the task that faces the Israeli government's Ministry of Immigrant Absorption, which offers services that include career guidance, counseling, and financial aid to the nation's prospective and new residents. It's obvious that Israelis themselves are very much aware of the synthetic nature of their nation building. On the evening of May 10, 2000, during the 52nd anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel, a ceremony took place in Jerusalem, in the area surrounding Theodor Herzl's tomb. I had the opportunity to attend the ceremony, which was presided over by Avraham Berg, the Speaker of the Knesset. I had met Berg at the Knesset just a few days earlier, when both of us participated in a meeting that dealt with the themes of cultural diversity and coexistence. I remember thinking that he was an exciting speaker, and I could see that most of the 2,000 or so Israelis in attendance were stirred by his remarks. My Israeli friends who accompanied me to Mauz-Herz translated Berg's remarks. He was urging his audience to live up to the vision of an idealized Israel where deep and troublesome societal divisions no longer exist, when the synthetic nation becomes cohesive. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin on November 4, 1995 by Yigal Amir, a Bar Ilan University law student, shocked Israeli society and left them asking how it was possible for one Israeli to kill another. Brennan Moses Hushovsky, an Israeli psychoanalyst, describes an Israeli soul-searching that took place after the assassination. Israeli intellectuals wondered how they could facilitate the coexistence of different political and religious groups and overcome the destructive splits among Israelis' multiple religious factions and ethnicities. In the long run, however, according to Moses Hushovsky, this did not occur. At the time of the ceremony, the country still had deep divisions. Berg's address referred to this condition and cried out for a solution. When Berg's address was finished, 12 Israelis representing different groups within the country spoke briefly in front of lit torches and symbolically presented themselves as a unified Israel. A young woman, Oz Sveta Tokayev, was a member of a group of 1 million recent immigrants from Russia. Zehava Baruch was the spokeswoman for Ethiopians. Boz Kitain, whose son was killed in a helicopter crash, reminded everyone of grieving parents in a country where young people faced real dangers. 2 teenagers, one Jewish and one Druze, Ziv Skakar and Daniela Nadim Issa, spoke together, suggesting that Jews and non-Jews can coexist in the State of Israel. Others among the dozen speakers reminded the audience that there were citizens who were directly affected by the Holocaust and citizens who were representative of women's rights groups. However, Muslim Israeli Arabs and ultra-Orthodox movements were not represented. In the excitement of the evening, however, one could visualize an idealized and unified Israel. Though I differentiate between synthetic nations and those in which one ethnically homogeneous group of people are dominant, making these distinctions is not always as easy in practice as it might seem. Over time, synthetic nations evolve a kind of homogeneity defined by common historical experience that can be spoken and expressed in a common language. Nevertheless, the synthetic and non-synthetic distinction remains useful for our purposes for several reasons. For example, a synthetic nation under stress may develop cracks in the society's mosaic of various ethnic, racial, and religious groups. During World War II, for example, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans were isolated in concentration camps despite the fact that they were not disloyal. After September 11, cracks appeared within the United States between those who are considered us and those who may be directly or symbolically connected with Islam. In practice, certain definitions of nationalism are very similar to definitions of ethnicity. For example, Rita Rogers, a psychiatrist at the University of California, Los Angeles, who has been studying international relations for decades, suggests that nationalism is a state of mind, echoing Stein's definition of ethnicity. William Peterson describes a nation as a people linked by common descent from putative ancestors and by its common territory, history, language, religion, and/or way of life. We find parallels with definition of ethnicity in Hans Kohns remarks too. Nationalism our identification with life and aspirations of uncounted millions whom we shall never know within a territory which we shall never visit in its entirety is qualitatively different from the love of a family or of some surroundings. It's qualitatively akin to the love of humanity or of the whole earth. Coast's definition only takes us so far, for there are varieties of nationalism, including varieties of post-colonial nationalism. Moreover, history reminds us all too well that the concept of nationalism is not always linked to liberty and high humanistic ideals, and may also be associated with racism, totalitarianism, and destruction. Nazi nationalism, for example, was founded upon racism and waged war on democratic and liberal ideas. As a result, there is a tendency among political scientists and scholars of international relations to differentiate between negative nationalism and positive, usually called patriotism. Novelist and cultural critic George Orwell described patriotism as devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world but has no wish to force upon other people, and nationalism as patriotism gone sour, power hunger tempered by self-deception. Scholars in political and social sciences have usefully distinguished between nationalism that is benign and civic and that which is malignant and authoritarian. There is also a close link between the concept of ethnicity and the concept of nation when the nation in question is composed of an ethnically homogeneous group of people. When Greece was born in the early 1830s, for example, it officially incorporated only ethnic Greeks as citizens. Therefore, the members of this nation-state were connected by the specificity I have described above as the province of ethnicity. And the outside world, except for ethnic Greeks living outside of the new nation-state, was other. The main general distinction to be made between a nation and an ethnic group is that nation implies political autonomy and established borders, or at least organizations that establish roles, positions, and status. But as I have suggested, ethnicity properly refers to a category more basic than nationality. Indeed, it seems that nationalism's day may now have passed. After the retreat of the European empires and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we may very well be living in an age of ethnicity. As historian Norman Itzkowitz and I have written, however, a focus on ethnicity, although not identified as such at the time, was present in earlier eras. It would certainly be amiss not to recognize the role of ethnicity in Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, and equally wrong-headed not to see the subsequent impact of that ethnic conflict in the New World. Many of the leading colonists, such as John Smith, had had their baptism of fire in the conquest of Ireland. They brought the lessons of that ethnic conflict with them. For them, the indigenous populations were often the Irish in other guises. Theories of modernization suggested that industry and trade would replace agriculture as the foundation of economy. Industrial society would require universal values that would replace tribal and local values, and new forms of communication would lead to cultural assimilation and the eventual disappearance of ethnic identities. The opposite seems to be the case, however, since ethnic identities have gathered strength in the face of dehumanization engendered by modernization. In many ways, the fate of modernization theory is similar to that of Leninist notion that the classless society that would be ushered in by socialism would form a bulwark against war that was the ultimate product of capitalist society. The unfolding of history undermined both modernization theory and the classless society. Whereas ethnicity is not a category of nature, the related category of race, starting in the 18th century, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, was based on the idea that human beings can be divided into subspecies according to their respective variations in skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other physical phenomena of nature. Racial distinctions have taken on the character of racism when assumed to reflect different stages of human development and used to support the systemic granting or withholding of rights and privileges. Racial divisions persist throughout the world, but its collective expression varies from one situation to another. Of course, Western Europe and its white colonies in North America, Africa, and Australia have experienced malignant racism, in which the target group, while in fact innocent, is perceived as dangerous by the destroying group. Today, however, racism per se has substantially been replaced, especially in Western Europe, with the newer notion of neo-racism. Neo-racism is grounded not in biology, but in anthropology and ideology. In some circles in Europe, for example, some people invoke the distinctions in religious customs, language, or value system specific to immigrants of African, Middle Eastern, or Asian origin to justify keeping those immigrants' communities emotionally, if not physically, separate. Neo-racism is similar to the concept of ethnocentrism, which denotes attitudes that uncritically or unjustifiably support the superiority of one ethnic group over others. Even this brief review of the different categories of large group identity suggests the need for flexibility in defining group identity concepts. The historical details of the actual situations at hand must be taken into account in assessing the substance and functioning of any particular large group. The Christian Copts of Egypt, for example, proudly identify themselves according to their religious difference from most people in their region, but they also believe that they are the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians who were governed by pharaohs. Thus, they separate themselves ethnically from the majority of Egyptians who are ethnically Arab. In order to feel secure in Egypt, however, they also consider themselves to be part of the Egyptian nation. Depending on the circumstances facing them at a particular historical moment, then Copts may define themselves as a group by religion, by ethnicity, or by nationality and feel secure or insecure accordingly. There is one last way of defining the identity of a large group: ideology. Some ideologies, such as Kemalism in Turkey, After the Turkish War of Independence 1919 to 1922 are confined within the boundaries of a specific large group or nation, and neither make nor aspire to make an impact elsewhere. Others, such as Soviet communism, press for an international audience. I want to emphasize, however, that ideological identity is of a different type from ethnic, national, and religious identities. It is not durable or integral in the ways that the other identity categories are. A political ideology may be modified or given up without destroying the basic sense of core sameness among the members of a large group. Russians and Czechs, for example, continue to perceive themselves as Russians and Czechs even though they no longer ascribe to communist ideology. Before we can understand why ethnic, national, and religious collective identities exercise such a powerful hold on people, subject them to political propaganda and other forms of manipulation, and sometimes make them follow their leaders blindly, we first need to review the psychoanalytic understanding of individual identity. The term identity in psychoanalysis is relatively new. Sigmund Freud himself seldom used it, and those who took up the discipline he had established tended to follow his example. Among the psychoanalysts who first brought the term to general attention was Erikson, who in 1956 seminally described a person's identity as a sustained feeling of inner sameness within oneself, and at the same time a persistent sharing of some kind of essential character with others. Following Erikson, it's now generally agreed that identity refers to a person's subjective experience of him or herself, and therefore should be distinguished from other related concepts such as character or personality. These latter terms delineate the collected impressions that other people gather from an individual's emotional expressions, modes of speech, and habitual ways of thinking and behaving, unlike character and personality. Then, identity designates the individual inner working model of him or herself and in the individual's integration of his or her past, present, and future into a smooth continuum of remembered, felt, and expected experience. An individual with a crystallized core identity therefore has a realistic body image, an inner sense of physical solidity, a subjective clarity about his or her gender, a well-internalized conscious, and most importantly for our purposes, an inner solidarity with one's group and its ideals. Thus, an individual's core identity and large group identity develop alongside one another. Adults can typically identify various aspects of what they perceive as their unique identity related to social or professional status. One may simultaneously perceive oneself as a physician and someone who plays handball, or as a carpenter and someone who enjoys reading. On the surface, these elements of one's identity seem to fit within Erikson's definition, but I do not believe that such manifestations truly reflect the sustained sense of basic sameness within oneself that Erikson identified. If a person's social or career identity is threatened, he or she may or may not experience anxiety in response, though anxiety is more likely if the threat is connected, mostly unconsciously, to one or more of the four fundamental internal danger signals identified by Freud: losing a loved one, his or her love, a body part, or self-esteem. Okay. By way of contrast, consider an adult decompensating into schizophrenia. His or her basic sense of self-identity over time is fragmenting. He or she may feel like a star exploding into a billion pieces. Such a person is certainly experiencing anxiety. Anxiety is so extreme that it is unspeakably terrifying. In order to escape this terror, as soon as he or she is able, he or she creates a new sense of identity, albeit a false, psychotic one. Such a person might reinvent him or herself as Jesus Christ or Mother Teresa. The sense of identity that such individuals are terrified of losing and are driven to replace is what I call their core identity. The loss of one's core identity is intolerable. It's psychological death. For our present purposes, it's crucial to differentiate core identity from less essential social or professional identities, since, as I will detail later in this chapter, an individual's large group identity is intimately connected to his or her personal core identity. Okay. As a result, serious threats to large group identity, such as shared helplessness and humiliation, are perceived by members of that large group as individually wounding and personally endangering. Psychologically speaking, they induce a collective response of anxiety or terror and shared defenses against the fragmentation of the self above and beyond each individual's specific personal defenses. Each individual's core identity develops primarily through completing two mental tasks that must be accomplished early in life: differentiation and integration. At the beginning of life, the infant, for practical purposes, does not know where he or she ends and where others, i.e., the mothers or other primary caretakers, begin. Differentiation is the psychobiological task of separating what belongs to oneself from what belongs to other people and things, both called object in psychoanalytic parlance. Before self-images are differentiated from object images, however, they are organized by their emotional and sensory contact as positive or negative, the pleasurable, satisfying, good images, and the unpleasant, unsatisfying, bad ones. We can therefore visualize normal development of identity and perception of others as a rather complicated highway interchange. Imagine a highway. For the first few miles of the highway, representing the first month of life, there is no dividing line. The infant does not fully comprehend where he or she ends and where others begin. At the present time, we know that an infant's mind has certain autonomy and the capability of sensing who he or she is. But for practical purposes, the infant fuses him or herself with his or her caretakers. This is why I say that in the first few miles of the highway, there is no line dividing the highway into me, self, or caretakers, other lanes. However, an infant soon begins to experience both pleasant, good, and unpleasant, bad sensations. At this point, from the second month to around the 6th month of the infant's life, the highway divides into two lanes: good, self-other, and bad, self-other. Soon, each lane becomes a road in its own right. As the infant's mind develops further, at about 6 to 8 months old, each road begins to divide into two lanes, marking the beginning of the infant's ability to separate positive self-images from positive images of others, and negative self-images from negative images of others. Eventually, the good and bad roads each separate into entirely distinct self-lanes, and other lanes and other lanes. Integration occurs when the two self lanes converge into a single road and the two other lanes meet in a separate single road. That is, integration begins when the child not only knows where he or she ends and others begin, but also is able to recognize that he or she is comprised of both positive and negative parts, and that his or her mother or any other person in his or her environment remains the same person over time, regardless of whether he or she is experiencing that person as satisfying or frustrating at any given moment. This integration for all practical purposes is completed when the child is approximately 36 months old, 3 years. Naturally, integrating what we call split self-images, good and bad, is easier when the emotions the child attaches to those images are not very intense. The same is true for the infant's split images of others. Integration becomes more and more difficult to achieve if the opposing images are connected with more and more powerful feelings. By the age of 36 months, however, a child has, for practical purposes, integrated his or her self-image as well as his or her object images. Okay, so let's see the picture. We have total self, total other. This is the beginning. Good and bad, self-other, undifferentiated, bad self-other, good self-other, bad self, bad other, good self, good other, total self, total other. 36 months, from 6 months to 36 months, okay, for 2.5 years. At this point, the child should be able to tolerate ambivalence, that is, to simultaneously love and hate a person at any given time and still recognize and experience that person is consistently the same person. Though, as we shall see, the process of integration is never total. The 3-year-old child's subjective experience of a sufficiently cohesive sense of self represents the foundation of his or her core identity. Once the child begins to know where he or she ends and others begin, the child becomes involved in another developmental task that, as we will see later in the chapter, is crucial for large group affiliation: identification. In identifying with others, the child unconsciously takes into his or her own sense of self the images and functions of significant people in his or her environment. The child thus enriches his or her core identity, for example, by identifying with the parent who controls and tames the child's temper tantrum. The child can perform the same function for him or herself, though the precise nature of identifications with the image of a mother's loyalty, a father's masculinity, or a teacher's honesty is different at each step on the developmental ladder. The child continually absorbs identifications into his or her self-image all the way through adolescence, the period in which an individual unconsciously re-examines and crystallizes his or her core identity. After the adolescent passage, an individual develops many new attachments and makes new identifications that change personal identity. But these changes are at the periphery of the sense of inner sameness that remains, for practical purposes, unchanged. As I began work at the psychology of political, ethnic, and religious conflict, I noted a need to expand the psychoanalytic conception of large group psychology in order to understand what makes a large group identity specific in its underlying psychological process. Freud had theorized that large group psychology reflects each member's Oedipal issues. An individual becomes loyal to the leader in the same way that an Oedipal boy sublimates his aggression against his father and identifies with him. The group forms as individuals who identify with and become loyal to the same leader, band together. Over years of observation, however, I have shifted the study of large group psychology from the individual's perception of what a large group means to him or her to the structure of large group psychology in its own right. When I think of the classical Freudian theory, I visualize the people arranged around a great maypole, which represents the group's leader, as if in a May Day dance of identification with each other and of idealization and support of the leader. I have since built upon this metaphor by imagining a large cloth over the people, a tent canvas of large group identity, and the people surrounding the pole are determined to keep the pole upright so that the canvas remains taut, a protective cover for the individuals beneath. That is to say, large group activities center on maintaining the integrity of the group's identity. Follower-leader interactions are just one element of this effort. In my experience, the leaders' and followers' effort to maintain, repair, and sometimes modify the large group identity contaminate or accompany and affect all real-world issues, from legal to economic to military. Large group rituals exist to maintain and or to strengthen the fabric of large group identity and to repair any wear and tear in it. Thus, I began to focus on the various efforts of the leader and his or her followers, from propaganda to massive aggression, to keep their tent canvas upright, rather than on members' perception and expectations of the leader's role alone. This doesn't mean, of course, that the psychology of individuals should be ignored. The scores or thousands or millions of people who live under the tent also wear individual clothing, their individual core identities, as well as the garments of family, clan, or professional subgroupings. But all of the people under the tent, men and women, rich and poor, wear the collective large group identity as if it were a shared skin. At times of collective stress, such as economic crisis, social upheaval, war, terrorist attack, or drastic political change, the tent's covering can take on greater importance than the various garments worn by the individual group members. The leaders' and followers' activities to protect their tent covering can be put in a spectrum, from non-destructive to destructive, depending on the nature and level of regression that a leader and or the followers experience. I have identified 7 threads that, when woven together, compose large group identity. Shared tangible reservoirs for images associated with positive emotion. Shared good identifications. Absorption of others' bad qualities. Absorptions of revolutionary or transforming leaders' internal words, chosen glories, chosen traumas, formation of symbols that develop their own autonomy. The last 4 threads especially represent specific processes in the development and maintenance of large group identity itself. Examining the first three illuminates how closely individual core identity and large group identity are intertwined. Though the formation of large group identity is often simply characterized as acculturation, we are now able to delineate the specific unconscious but shared psychological process involved in its evolution. Shared reservoir. The first thread of large group identity is woven into the core of the individual quite early in life through the child's growing contact with the external world. Both individual and large group identity begin to form in earnest and become intertwined at around the age of 36 months, when the child has accomplished the task of integrating his or her sense of self. As described in the last section, until then, when frustrated or satisfied, the child experiences him or herself as two warring selves, the good and the bad. Though this milestone is unquestionably a crucial one, it's important to recognize that integration is a relative term. The process is by no means complete at this point. Some images of the self and of others' objects, both good, associated with the child's own sense of peak pleasure, and bad, associated with his or her sense of peak aggression, remain unintegrated at this early age, because these fragments and the emotions associated with them threaten to destabilize the child's recently established core identity. They must be discarded. If the child doesn't rid him or herself of them, he or she will be unable to perceive his or her identity realistically. Because these stray elements can create problems for the child, he or she must develop ways of coping with the threat. Among the various psychological mechanisms children employ for this purpose, externalization, an early form of the more familiar mechanism of projection, or putting unwanted images from one's mind onto outside objects, is both critical and ubiquitous. For example, a very young child falls down but does not want to be thought clumsy. The child says, "I didn't fall down, it was my doll that fell." This child has externalized his or her injured self-image onto the doll, and the doll thus becomes a reservoir for some component of the child's own image. Subsequently, an uncle or aunt may become a reservoir for the child's unintegrated good images and affects, and the child will therefore idealize his relative rather than him or herself. Later in life, the child may re-internalize and integrate some of what was externalized onto the uncle or aunt, and thereby develop a more realistic view of him or herself as well as of the uncle or aunt. Some childhood externalizations are temporary, whereas others may persist for years. The special significance a child places on a person or thing by externalizing unintegrated good images of the self or of others doesn't necessarily create a bond with the child's large group, or establish any particular aspect of large group identity. It is rather simply a part of the personal developmental experience, formally mutable and changing frequently. For example, a special doll or cherished relative may be replaced by something or someone else, even though the child may keep the original item as a memento for many years, or may develop a lifelong friendship with a person from his or her childhood. There are certain conditions, however, under which externalization actually initiates a very early crucial investment in a large group identity and a sense of alliance with the other children in a large group. Though many of the reservoirs a child may use to promote and protect his or her developing core identity do not offer a connection with historical events, others are imbued with special meaning for the specific group into which he or she is becoming acculturated. Children are at first generalists in their large group identities. To borrow Erik Erikson's term, although they remain individual with their own specific psychic compositions, the large group component of identity becomes more specific as the child's internal world becomes tied to the external world through tangible shared items and experiences that are culturally and historically significant to their parent and other significant caretakers. Core individual and large group identity thus become inextricably intertwined when the repositories that receive children's unintegrated positive self and object images and associated peak pleasant or unpleasant effects are shared by all children in the large group and constant. I have called such culturally significant image containers suitable reservoirs for externalization. For example, going to a sauna is an experience that links together all Finnish children, even those who will never meet during their lifetimes. As adults, they use this practice as an ethnic marker. Note the Finnish saying, "A day without a sauna is like a day without sunshine." There are countless other examples we could adduce. Every ethnic, religious, national, or other large group shares a set of recognizable suitable reservoirs. Though a child cannot be forced to use certain items and experiences as reservoirs, he or she often receives conscious and unconscious guidance from parents and others in choosing things that hold commonly held significance for members of the large group. Without the individual child's conscious awareness, then he or she is subtly initiated into the large group identity or identities by becoming allied with the other children in the large group through the common material items that permanently absorb the unintegrated good, self, and object images of all group members. Because it develops so early, then large group identity exists through the depends upon external phenomena before it's clearly felt as an internal feature of the individual. As the child's mental capacities enlarge, interacting with the adults in his or her environment and identifying with these adults' images help the child to form more sophisticated ideas about large group membership. For example, more abstract concepts such as Scottishness or Finnishness become associated with the suitable reservoirs that are indeed at the foundation of a large group's identity. A Scottish boy, for instance, becomes aware that a kilt or bagpipe represents and is associated with many things: masculinity, clan and national history, specific heroes, battles for independence won and lost, songs and poems, language and dialect, and other specific features of the large group's history. Projections of good thoughts, perceptions, and feelings more sophisticated than mere externalization of good self-images and or internalized good object images increasingly accompany externalization into suitable reservoirs. Concurrently, the boy internalizes specific aspects of an abstract consciousness. These aspects are now felt or sensed both consciously and unconsciously as a part of the individual's core identity. A persistent sense of we-ness eventually becomes established as something inside the person. Still, suitable reservoirs remain as significant external links to the individual's internal sense of sameness, though at times the reservoirs may revert to a kind of ordinariness. Thus, a Scot away from home may listen to a recording of bagpipe music when he is homesick or when he otherwise feels that his core identity needs patching up, but he does not necessarily need or want to listen to bagpipe music every day. Under stressful conditions, the members of a group may return to using tangible articles in a developmentally regressive, externalized way, or may establish new suitable reservoirs in order to refortify group bonds. During Israelis' occupation of the Gaza Strip, for example, many Palestinians carried in their pockets, where they could not be seen by Israeli soldiers, small stones painted with the Palestinian colors. These stones were an adult version of a shared reservoir, keeping parts of Palestinian large group identity safe and creating an invisible network of Palestinianness. Under ordinary circumstances, the large group identity that is located in shared reservoirs is abstracted and internalized by the individuals that comprise the large group. In this case, however, the threat that the large group collectively perceived caused it to reactivate the need to use shared reservoirs for externalization. Good identifications. Shared reservoirs are closely related to the second thread of which the cloth of a large group identity is woven. Identifications with individuals in the immediate environment who belong to specific religious, ethnic, or national group also play a significant role in incorporating elements of large group identity into each child's personal core identity. Robert Embed's study on the evolution of the infant mind suggests the existence of a psychobiological potential for we-ness and group-related behavior. Because the environment of an infant or a young child is restricted to parents, siblings, relatives, and family friends, the extent of we-ness in infancy doesn't directly include a dimension of large group identity. The adults in any child's environment do obviously belong to a specific large group, but the infant or young child, mentally unready to comprehend large group affiliation or to differentiate any one such affiliation from any other with which it has no intimate contact, identifies with whatever he or she sees, touches, hears, smells, experiences. Because the child identifies with his or her caretakers as individuals, he or she comes to identify with a specific set of cultural practices, including especially the language that the caretakers observe and share with others outside in the child's immediate surroundings. Even before reaching the crucial milestone of integrating his or her core identity for practical purposes, at roughly 36 months of age, a child begins to absorb overt and covert aspects of his or her fellow group members, shared attitudes, culture, and values via early identifications with his or her caretakers. Of course, not all developmental identifications relate to large group identity. Many identifications function, for example, to teach the child to do things as his or her parents do, to be a mother or father in the future, and to sustain the family's ideals and values. Over time, individual children within a large group tend to acquire inclinations and capacities shared by all children in that group. The same language, similar food preferences, and shared nursery rhymes, songs, and dances during the Oedipal phase of life, as well as during later phases. More sophisticated identifications enlarge the child's mental life and his or her associations with large group identity. Especially in adolescence, identifications with teachers, religious authorities, peer groups, and community and large group leaders cultivate children's investments in religion, ethnicity, and nationality, and nurture their sense of differentiation from those who are unlike the group and or inimical to it. A child's investment in his or her large group depends substantially on what factors the adults in the large group collectively perceive as most important. Ethnicity, I am an Arab; religion, I am a Catholic; nationality, I am a German, or a combination of these. It's important to recall that as a large group organizing principle, ideology is less durable than religion, ethnicity, or nationality because it is less basic, more intellectual. A child born in Hyderabad, India, for example, would be focused primarily on religious and cultural issues as he or she developed a large group identity. Since adults there define their dominant large group identities according to religious affiliation, Muslim or Hindu. A child born in Cyprus would absorb a dominant large group identity defined by ethnic and nationalistic sentiments, because what is currently decisive in this part of the world is whether one is Greek or Turkish, not whether one is Greek Orthodox, Christian, or Sunni Muslim. Though they may become important later in life, questions of investment in ethnicity versus religion or nationality versus race are not as essential to understanding large group identity as are the psychodynamic processes of linking the individual's core identity to the large group identity that is historically primarily at the time of the child's development. As a result of certain relatively uncommon circumstances, such as having parents belonging to different races, religions, or nationalities, a child may come to identify with more than one ethnic, national, or religious group. As psychoanalyst Edith Jacobson noted, simultaneous identification with various others may be in sharp conflict with each other, so that reconciliation and integration may present extraordinary problems. W. C. Booth reports the poignant story of a young man of Navajo descent who seemed thoroughly steeped in his two cultures, traditional Navajo and mainstream American, when paralyzed in an accident. However, he did not know whether to turn to the Navajo medicine man or the Western doctor for treatment. In my own work in Transylvania in 1993 and South Ossetia in 1998, interviews with individuals born to mixed marriages, Romanian and Hungarian in the former case, South Ossetian and Georgian in the latter, revealed that identity difficulties were especially acute when drastic socio-political changes occurred or when wars broke out between the groups. In my clinical work in the United States, I have treated individuals born in the South to wealthy white families and raised primarily by African American servants. Individuals who could put their two mothers on a continuum fared better than those with unloving mothers and emotionally satisfying nannies who tended to have internal difficulties responding to interact incidents in external reality. As I have suggested, adolescence is a crucial time for crystallizing the first two elements of large group identity. As the adolescent unconsciously re-examines both childhood investment in the images, whether realistic or not, of people he or she has known, that attachment to culturally appropriate suitable reservoirs, he or she unconsciously decides which aspect of large group identity will become the fixed and permanent means of connecting him or her with others in the large group with which he or she is affiliated. The sauna, for example, may remain as a tangible item that connects a young Finn to his or her fellow Finns. But it's also during adolescence that his or her persistent abstract sense of Finnishness, beyond any specific traditional practice, takes shape as an object of emotional alliance that the individual shares with his or her peers. After the first and second threads of large group identity have been interwoven into an individual's sustained sense of self in adolescence, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to change the original sense of we-ness associated with his or her large group identity. However, under exceptional circumstances, the original sense of we-ness might be milder. I once worked with a young woman in analysis whose Jewish father had settled into a conservative city in the southern United States. The father had changed his Jewish-sounding name because he thought his business would benefit, and he had married a Christian woman. His daughter, my patient, had been raised as a Christian and never consciously saw herself as having any connection to Jewishness. She knew of her father's history and reported that he had passed as a Christian because it was good for his business. When 6 years into her analysis, Israeli athletes were murdered at the 1972 Olympics in Munich, she underwent a change in religious and cultural identity. The shock of the event caused her to sense her heretofore repressed investment in her father's heritage. At the same time, she became aware that in spite of his overt behavior, deep down her father had kept his emotional investment in Judaism. Though she never formally converted to Judaism, she now felt comfortable joining her Christian and Jewish selves in an adaptive manner. In general, though, the individual cannot truly escape the fundamental childhood emotional investment in his or her original large group identity, but can only repress or deny it, rationalizing that he or she now belongs to a higher entity, i.e., that the individual belongs not to his or her original large group, but to human family. In the case of immigration, integration into a new country is generally smoother if the immigrant arrives voluntarily rather than as a refugee subjected to forced immigration. If the immigrant still feels accepted in the country left behind, he or she, upon completion of the work of mourning, may become bicultural, resulting in a sense of belonging to both cultures. But in short, a change in his or her identity occurs. From history, we know that large groups of people, like individual volunteer immigrants, also can change their collective identity over the couple of decades or centuries, especially if they gain something in the process, such as economic benefits. In 14th century Bosnia, for example, many southern Slavs became Muslims within the first century of Ottoman Muslim rule over this part of the world. By converting to Islam, they avoided paying certain taxes which the Ottoman demanded from non-Muslim subjects. These converts were the ancestors of modern Bosniaks, who have emerged as a separate ethnic group from the Serbs and Croats, who are also southern Slavs. Absorption of others' bad qualities. Although the two threads we have examined so far link an individual's personal core identity with his or her primary large group identity, a group's identity never exists in a vacuum. It always joins the identity of another group. Thus, the third thread in the canvas of an ethnic, racial, national, or religious identity is produced by the interactions between the two neighboring groups. Like a child who identifies with the way his or her mother mostly unconsciously perceives him or her, members of a large group may themselves weave into the fabric of their shared identity a thread originally placed there by a dominant opposing group. In order to understand this third thread, picture two large group tents side by side. Individuals in the first tent throw mud, excrements, and refuse, that is, externalize their bad images of themselves and others and project their own unwanted thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and expectations onto the canvas of the second tent. For example, a child of Polish Jewish peasant origins living in America, far from the dangers of the old anti-Semitic world, is taught to spit 3 times when passing a Catholic church. This may be dismissed simply as superstition, but it also partakes of the notion of the church as a suitable target of externalization. It is easier to give up targets of externalization in an atmosphere of comparative safety, but memories of them linger on. If the individuals in the first 10 dominate those in the second, and if their externalization and projections are backed by economic or other physical force, what they throw onto the second tent to some extent saturates its fabric and is absorbed into existing threads of the second group's identity. That is, the negative externalization and projection may evolve as a permanent part of the subjugated group's identity, because the stain is composed of bad or undesirable elements originally belonging to the dominant group. The recipient group may experience anxiety over this large group marker and may develop defensive signs and symptoms to conceal it. U.S. psychiatric literature and the 20th century provides an example of this phenomenon in the delusion of whiteness, often reported in African American patients suffering from psychosis. For decades, this delusion was misunderstood. John Lynn's pioneering 1914 studies of the color complex asserted that this delusion reflected African American patients' simple desire to be white. Subsequent publications suggested various other explanations referring to a variety of external factors, but not one publication mentioned white racism as a precipitation factor. These researchers tended to place responsibility on black parents, minimizing the role of the dominant group in creating a threat of inadequacy, humiliation, and denigration in both the individual and group identities of these parents. For instance, one researcher stated that because African American parents knew that preferential treatment had been given to slaves of mixed ancestry, they wanted light skin for themselves and their children and passed on this desire to their children in early mother-child interactions. By the late 1960s and 70s, African American psychiatrists such as Charles Pinderhughes and Charles Wilkerson had begun to publish on the experience of being a reservoir for white people's externalizations and projections. In my own work at the segregated state-owned Cherry Hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina in the early 1960s, I observed that many black patients who expressed the wish to be white simultaneously experienced anxiety about the idea of bearing white blood, that whiteness was desirable on one level and dreaded on another, reflected the fact that by wanting to be like those who denigrated them, African Americans were both identifying with their oppressors and denying the pain of being reservoir for the bad elements those oppressors had consigned to them, such as sexual aggressiveness and intellectual inferiority. Similarly, assimilated Jews living safely in America sometimes joke about the possibility of hiring someone to beat up their children for being Jewish as a means of communicating to their children what it has meant and may mean again to be Jewish. Thus, they simultaneously deny the pain of the Jewish experience throughout history by telling a joke about anti-Semitic violence and identify with the perpetrators by becoming the agent of such violence. Absorption of leaders' internal worlds. The fourth thread is woven into the cloth of large group identity by certain types of leaders, a transforming or charismatic leader such as Vladimir Lenin, Mahatma Gandhi, Mao Zedong, and most recently Osama bin Laden, brings hundreds of thousands of millions of people out of political isolation and into a new kind of political participation, which can either be adaptive or destructive. Such leaders often do something else as well, driven to meet the requirements of their own internal worlds. They reshape the external world and the psychosocial and political identity of their large group. In order for large group identity to bend to the psychic organization of its leader in this way, however, the large group must be in a state of what psychoanalysis term regression. Transforming or charismatic leaders reflect the group's sentiments in the opinions that they express, their public appearances, the speeches that they deliver, their avowed likes and dislikes, and even the way that they dress. Combined with the externalizing and projecting aspects of their personal psychologies, these elements influence followers, create new political ideologies, inflame or tame religious, national or ethnic sentiments, and sometimes create new or modified suitable reservoirs for externalization. A small example from the historical relationships between Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, and the Turkish people illustrates this process. Until 1925, Turkish men did not wear Western-style hats. Hats belonged to the infidel, and so were not suitable reservoir for Venus. Some Turkish men in villages and cities wore various sorts of turban-like headgear. Turkish intellectuals and public servants wore fez, previously worn in North Africa and by the Greek Christians who inhabited Ottoman-held islands in the Mediterranean. The fez had been introduced as a new head covering for the Ottoman military in the mid-1820s. In the 1829, the fez was decreed compulsory for all classes of Ottoman officials. As its use spread beyond the government corps, it became a symbol of Turkishness. And indeed, a universal symbol of Islam. After a full century of assimilation, then the fez was to be extirpated from Turkish society because it symbolized the Ottoman past, not the new Turkish Republic Atatürk wished to establish. In our extensive study of Atatürk's life, Princeton's historian Norman Itzkowitz and I concluded that Atatürk's insistence that the new Turkey should be secular and westernized derived in part from an externalization onto the nation, which had suffered greatly in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, of his image of his grieving mother who had lost 3 children before Atatürk's birth and had been widowed when the future leader was only 7 years old. In reality, his mother, who had turned to religion for solace from these losses, had smothered the young Atatürks, so he had much unconscious personal motivation to make her happy and thereby to enable her to be a better mother to him. By extension, this personal motivation may have prompted him to guide the new Turkey away from what he perceived to be the smothering influence of religion, for Atatürk fez were associated with religion and thus had to be purged from his new superior state. On August 25, 1925, Atatürk traveled to Kastamonu, north of the capital city of Ankara, which had been described to him as one of the most conservative districts in Turkey. When he arrived, he appeared in a gray linen suit, its cut decidedly Western. He wore a tie and carried a white Panama hat in his hand. As though on signal, all the assembled men shed their Muslim-associated headgear, fez, turbans, kalpaks, as Atatürk stepped into the crowd. By the name that Atatürk returned to Ankara 9 days later, he had destroyed the fez as an appropriate symbol of Turkishness. For Atatürk's Turkey, the Western-style hat was the new suitable reservoir. While this example illustrates the influence of one's leader's actions on a large group in his ability to express large group identity in a relatively benign fashion, there are other examples of leader influence that can encourage large group progression. We will return in detail to the crucial question of how the personality of the leader is a significant factor in the life of a large group in Part 3. Chosen glories and chosen traumas. Understanding the 5th and 6th threads that compose large group identity, what I call chosen glories and chosen traumas, requires collaboration between psychoanalysts and historians, for these 2 elements play by far most important roles in particularizing each large group's identity and connecting the group with its past, whether realistically recalled or modified by wishes, fantasies, and mental defenses. Large groups tend to hold on to mental representations of events that include a shared feeling of success and triumph among group members. Heavily mythologized over time, such events and the persons appearing in them become elements of large group identity. Chosen glories are passed from generation to generation through caretaker-child interactions and by participation in ceremonies that recall the past success. It's not difficult to understand why parents and other important adults pass on the mental representation of chosen glories to their children. Saturated with self-esteem, enhancing feelings, they are pleasurable to share. Likewise, chosen glories link a group's children to each other and to the group by enhancing individual self-esteem. In times of stress or war-like situations, leaders often reactivate chosen glories in order to bolster their group's identity. During the Gulf War, for instance, Saddam Hussein depended heavily on chosen glories to galvanize the Iraqi people's support. even associating himself with Sultan Saladin, who defeated the Christian Crusaders in the 12th century. By reviving a past event and a past hero, Saddam aimed to create the illusion that a similar triumphal destiny was awaiting his people, and that, like Saladin, he was a hero. Saddam, like Saladin, was born in Tikrit. But it did not matter to Saddam that Saladin was not an Arab but a Kurd, or that he ruled from Egypt rather than Iraq. It did not matter to his people either, from the emphasis was principally on the ancient hero's religious identity. The idea was that, like Saladin, Muslim Saddam would also defeat the infidel United States and its allies. As we know, more than a decade after the Gulf War, Saddam's expectation did not materialize, and he was toppled by the United States and his coalition partners. A leader's reference to chosen glories excites his followers simply by stimulating an already existing shared marker of a large group success. This role of the chosen trauma, the collective mental representation of an event that has caused a large group to face drastic common losses, to feel helpless and victimized by another group, and to share a humiliating injury in sustaining large group identity and its cohesiveness, is more complex than that of the chosen glory. Clinical investigations of members of groups that have suffered a massive trauma at the hands of an enemy group reveal that although each individual has his or her own unique identity and personal reaction to the trauma, all or almost all group members have developed injured self-images as a result. Studies of the second and third generations of a group that has suffered such a trauma, such as the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, clearly show that the mental representation of the shared tragedy is transmitted to subsequent generations in varying levels of intensity. There is far more to this transgenerational transmission of massive trauma than children mimicking the behavior of parents or hearing stories of the event told by the older generation. Nor is it a matter merely of transgenerational sympathy, powerful as that emotion may be. Rather, it is the end result of mostly unconscious psychological processes by which survivors deposit into their progeny's core identities their own injured self-images. In order to gain relief from feelings of shame and humiliation, the inability to be assertive, and the inability to mourn, a Holocaust survivor, for example, deposits his or her image of him or herself as a damaged person into the developing personal identity of his or her child. Thus, the parent's self-image lives on in the child. Then, the parent unconsciously assigns to the image of him or herself that is now in the child specific tasks of reparation that rightfully belong to the survivor. To reverse shame and humiliation, to turn passivity into activity, to tame the sense of aggression, and to mourn the losses associated with the trauma. The actual deaths of relatives and friends in the original tragedy, the loss of self-esteem and prestige, and the loss of land and other valuable things. What is passed to the offspring is not the traumatized person's memories of the event. Then, for memory can belong only to the survivor of trauma and cannot be transmitted. Deposited parental self-image are the only element by which the representation of traumatic history can be passed from person to person. Since all the injured self-images that various parents in a traumatized group transmit to their children refer to the same event, a shared image of the tragedy develops. By sharing this image of the ancestors' trauma, a new generation of the group is unconsciously knit together. Over time, the mental representation of the original tragedy becomes a crucial marker of large group identity. Once the mental representation of a shared traumatic event becomes a chosen trauma, the actual history of the event is no longer especially important. What is essential is this marker's unseen power to link the members of the group together in a persistent sense of sameness through history. As a result, a chosen trauma may assume new functions as it passes from one generation to the next. In some generations, it may support a shared and sustained sense and idealization of victimhood. In others, it may be used to construct the group as avengers. In the Protestant Reformation, historian and psychoanalyst Peter Lurenberg discovers an example of the crucial bridge between massive shared trauma and historical process. It was a trauma of major proportions, whose effect took centuries to work out to a new and secure equilibrium. One response of European religion, culture, and politics to these traumata was a new pity, flagellation, widespread practice of torture, and epidemics of demonic possessions, which seized groups in the late 15th century for the first time. In this period, we see the emergence of the witch mania that tortured and killed thousands. In 1 year, the Bishop of Wurzburg killed 900, the Bishop of Bamberg over 600, in Savoy 800 were burned in a festival. In 1514, 300 were executed in the small diocese of Como. A chosen trauma also may remain dormant in a group's collective memory over many generations at times of stress, when the group's identity is threatened, and inactive chosen trauma can be revived through the propaganda or hate speech and may be used by leaders to inflame the group's shared feelings about themselves and their enemy or enemies. In what I call a time collapse, the chosen trauma is then experienced as if it has happened only yesterday. Feelings, perceptions, and expectations associated with the past heavily contaminate those connected to current events and current enemies, leading to irrational political decision-making and destructive behavior. As unlikely as it may seem, for example, the chosen trauma critical for understanding the tragedies in Bosnia in 1992 and Kosovo in 1999, the Serbian people's defeat as the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Despite the fact that the leaders of both sides, Ottoman Sultan Murad I and Serbian Prince Lazar, were both killed, and despite the fact that Serbia remained autonomous for some 80 years after the Battle of Kosovo evolved as the major chosen trauma, marking the end of a glorious period of Serbian power and the beginning of their subjugation to the Ottoman Empire. In some periods, Prince Lazar's image was used to cement a shared sense of victimization and martyrdom under Muslim rule. At others, his image became a symbol of Serbs' desire to reverse the humiliation of the loss by reconquering Kosovo. Though the province was taken back from the Ottoman Turks in the late 19th century, Lazar's ghost still was not put to rest after the collapse of communism. He and the Battle of Kosovo were resurrected by Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic to reactivate the 600-year-old memory of humiliation and the accompanying desire for revenge. The time collapse that they facilitated through sophisticated as well as base propaganda prepared the Serbian people emotionally for the atrocities they would eventually commit against the Bosnian and Kosovar Muslims, whom modern Serbs came to perceive as extensions of the Ottoman enemy of distant history. Thus, the Serbian large group identity was reinforced and reinvigorated by the lasting emotional power of this ancient event at terrible cost to non-Serbs. Though eyes untrained in human psychology may not see the relationship Leuenbergs observe, trauma is the theoretical link from individual to group, cohort, population, nation, the world. When representatives of enemy groups face each other across a negotiating table, each group's chosen traumas are easily revived, and without an appreciation of the psychological mechanisms at work, it can be very difficult for would-be mediators to interpret their responses generated by reactivated chosen traumas. Between 1994 and 1996, I served as a member of facilitating team that brought together Estonian, Russian, and Russian-speaking Estonian leaders for a series of unofficial dialogues aimed at easing the many political, social, and diplomatic tensions that afflicted Russia and Estonia after the latter regained its independence in 1991. Many present-day conflicts cannot be fully understood without first understanding how historical hurts and grievances survive from generation to generation as chosen traumas. These psychological genes exist within many large groups and can be manipulated by leaders in subsequent generations to mobilize the group. The reactivation of a chosen trauma may contribute to irritation, decision-making, and inhumane acts. Chosen trauma, transgenerational transmission, change of function, ethnic, national, religious marker, a psychological gene of the large group, reactivation of chosen trauma, enhancement of leader-follower interaction, time collapse, entitlement to revenge or revictimization, magnification of current large group conflict, irrational decision-making, mobilization of large group activities. In such a discussion, participants tend to become spokespersons for their large group, and this situation was no exception. Each wore the canvas of his or her group identity as his or her primary garment instead of personal clothing. At the point in the discussion, the ethnic Estonians refused to show appreciation for Soviet support against the Nazis or for Soviet capital investments in Estonia. The ethnic Russians responded by asserting that Russia had defended all of Western civilization against Tatar and Mongol assaults. To an untutored eye, this exchange would perhaps seem at best irrelevant, perhaps a non sequitur. What have the medieval golden hordes to do with Soviet expenditures? The connection is, in a word, humiliation. The Russians, the sons and daughters of an empire, felt humiliated by the Estonians, the sons and daughters of people who had lived under the domination of others for almost a millennium. Russians turned to centuries-old memories of victimization at the hand of 13th and 14th century invaders in order to hold on the thread of collective identity that strengthens their sense of we-ness. In the Russian large group collapse into Russia's relationship with Estonia in the mid-90s, the revived mental representation of shared historical trauma naturally complicated any attempts at negotiation of current conflicts. Symbols. The seventh thread of a group's identity is the symbol that functions to tie together some or all of the other threads. Through such a symbol may originally stand for any one of the 6 threads already described. It eventually develops its own autonomy as a component of the large group tent. Before we observe how symbols function as part of the fabric of large group identity, however, let us review briefly the classical psychoanalytic understanding of the symbol more generally. In everyday life, certain symbols such as the red octagon that symbolizes stop function on the force of convention. In psychoanalysis, the concept of a symbol is rather narrower. Psychoanalysis is most concerned with how and why symbols originate in an individual's unconscious and function in his or her internal conflict. Freud, in Interpretation of Dreams and many other subsequent writings, argued that symbols repress unacceptable wishes and ideas and therefore function to reduce anxiety. An individual is aware of the symbol itself but unaware of what it symbolizes. If someone dreams of a snake, for instance, he or she actually sees an image of a snake, but does not consciously perceive the penis that the snake may represent. Initially, Freud believed that symbols representing body parts, body functions, birth, death, sexuality, and childhood, intimate relationships with parents or siblings are universal, included in a kind of phylogenetic memory. This belief has now been largely replaced by the assumptions that the recurrence of such symbols across cultures has to do with the similarity of human beings' experiences and interests from infancy onward and of the cognitive processes involved in symbol formation. In considering the function of symbols in large groups' identity, I focus here not on those that signify similarly across many cultures, but on those that are valued in specific ways by only one large group. Large group symbols tend to be unique, but when many groups deploy the same symbol, each tends to attach minor or major differences to it to specify the common object's particular significance to that group. For example, stars appear as symbols on numerous national flags, but the Star of David only signifies Jewishness. Composed of 2 overlapping triangles creating a 6-point star, the symbol was traditionally interpreted cross-culturally as representing male and female bodies joined together. For Jews, however, the symbol was associated with the biblical king Solomon, son of David and Bathsheba. With it is said Solomon exorcised demons and summoned angels. Jews subsequently understood the symbol to represent YHWH, Yahweh or God. Because of its association with Solomon for Jews, the 2 overlapping triangles came to be known as the Cilium Salomonis, Solomon's seal, or David's shield. Today it is usually known as the Star of David. The image of Prince Lazar, as I mentioned earlier in this chapter, was used for centuries as a symbol of Serbian identity in folk songs, religious icons, paintings, sculpture, and other shared cultural forms upon close examination. it becomes clear that Lazar's image became an element binding some of the other threads of Serbian ethnic identity together. It not only became a suitable reservoir for Serbian children's unintegrated good images and projected idealizations, but also evoked the Serbian chosen trauma, which was transformed into a chosen glory when the Serbs succeeded in battle in the 19th and 20th centuries. During the communist period, the Yugoslavian government officially denigrated Lazar's image as a symbol of reactionary nationalism as part of its efforts to amalgamate Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, and others into brothers and sisters united under higher Yugoslavian ideals. But the various ethnic group identities remained very much alive, as did the image of Lazar, whose name was affixed to a brand of red wine during this period. Another was named after Princess Melissa, Lazar's wife. We might even imagine that when Serbs in communist Yugoslavia selected this wine to drink, they were unconsciously continuing to identify with the symbol of Lazarus as a national hero. The respective evolutions of the Star of David's association with Jewish identity and Lazar's connection to Serbian identity are relatively clear, but often the original significance of a symbol for an ethnic, national, or religious collective is difficult to pinpoint because its significance generally developed over long periods of time and by unconscious, though shared psychological processes. Take, for instance, the animal symbols that frequently represents national and ethnic group identities, a phenomenon that goes back to the beginnings of human history. The symbolic significance of certain animals, such as those associated with fertility, warfare, wisdom, or specific behaviors, is obvious. In other cases, animals are used to represent complex and abstract ideas. For still other groups, certain animal symbols were adopted by particularly important leaders and thereby elevated or resurrected as unifying symbols. Adolf Hitler's fascination and identification with the wolf, for example, has been well documented. As a boy, he had been pleased to find that his given name was derived from the Old German Athelwolf, meaning noble wolf. Hitler named his favorite dog Wolf and generalized his identification with this predatory animal by calling the SS his pack of wolves. And at times he also believed that the German people followed him because they realized that now a wolf had been born. Other large group symbols have assumed their representational status by explicit and intentional agreement. In cases of purely ideological identity, the large group's history does not belong to the distant past. So the history of the symbols, such as the Soviet hammer and sickle, may be well known. Today, symbols displayed on flags are often chosen through a vote or general consensus, as are the birds and flowers of each U.S. state. Sometimes such choices are the subject of intense debate, competition, and rivalry. Even when the process of such selection assumes apparently irrational proportions, indicating that large group symbols are psychologically powerful things, in the end, the link between signifier and signified is clear, like the red octagon that signifies stop. When a large group is under stress, however, that clearly relation between signifier and signified may be lost, and its symbols may come to be perceived as what psychoanalysis calls proto-symbols. That is, no longer as a symbol representing the group identity, but as the thing itself. Large group members and their leaders are constantly engaged in the work of protecting their shared identity and keeping the 7 threads described in this chapter securely woven together. Often we are not even aware of this work, for it is, as we will see, part of the everyday life of a large group. When a large group's tent canvas is shaken by conflict or humiliation, or begins to show wear, the members become keenly aware of their group identity and of their collective efforts to maintain, repair, and stabilize it. At all times, though, these collective efforts take the form of shared rituals. In Chapter 3, we will look closely at the large group rituals of identity from which political propaganda and political decision-making, whether used for poisoning or healing, derive their power. First, however, we must examine the psychological condition under which large groups become susceptible to political propaganda, maladaptive political decision-making, and massive destructive behavior. Large group progression, they experience a call plunging back into a world of fear and desire. Okay, that's Chapter 1. and Chapter 2, where we'll read about regression.